You are watching the financial collapse of Britain, the once richest, once most powerful empire on which the sun never set. Why has it become so impoverished today? Why is it no longer as strong? Why did it lose its power? This story cannot be fully understood unless it is told from the very beginning. And contrary to what many believe, it does not start with India's independence. Its roots lie in something much older, a build-up from the past finally breaking the surface. On the contrary, the story actually begins on the day Britain was at its strongest, but its money had run out. On the 15th of August 1947, when a flag was lowered from the sky over Delhi, a centuries-long internal bleeding, unseen but never stopping, finally surfaced. That moment was when the hidden leg of Britain's collapse became visible. This was not merely an independence ceremony. It was the surrender of a bankrupt empire forced by financial failure. Because although Britain stood as the victorious power at the end of World War II, everywhere, the state of its treasury made that victory a disguised defeat. Debt to GDP had exceeded 200%. The treasury had neither gold nor money left to cover war expenses. It was empty, and an empty treasury is useless, weak. Exports had collapsed, trade routes had stalled, income had vanished while expenses soared, and the post-war loans Britain had taken were breaking its back. And most importantly, unlike the other colonies, they could no longer exploit the wealth of their most valuable colony, India. For nearly 2 centuries, India had been the financial engine keeping the empire alive. With the war, that engine shattered. The once glorious flow of wealth was replaced by massive deficits and unpayable debt. But this collapse did not happen overnight. It wasn't like Nazi Germany or Venezuela. A sudden morning where people wake up to a system that no longer works. They planned their collapse systematically in an orderly way so the damage would be minimized. Because the inevitability of collapse had already become undeniable. They knew it, and planned accordingly. And they also intended to hand this great power into the hands of someone familiar, someone they could work with. Everything began at the end of the year 1600. On December 31st, Queen Elizabeth of Britain signed a document, and the direction of history changed. The East India Company was born, a structure designed to meet the country's needs and fill its treasury, without using state resources but under state control. Its name was a company, but despite its corporate appearance, within the next century its organic ties with Britain made it more of a state than many states. At first it seemed innocent: spices, tea, cloth, small caravans, small agreements. But those small trading ships evolved within a few decades into something enormous: a private army, a tax collection system, a machine of occupation and extraction. Every valuable resource in the places it entered was taken and transferred to Britain. By the 18th century, this company owned a private army of 260,000 fully professional soldiers. This number was twice the size of Britain's official army at the time. In 1757, the Battle of Plassey became a breaking point. The heartbeat of Bengal stopped there, because this system no longer resembled trade. And after its victory, the company was granted Diwani, the right to collect taxes from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The labor, taxes, and production of 30 million people now flowed directly into the company's treasury. Taxes were being collected, it had its own army, its own legal system. Trade had ended, domination had begun. The company was the ruler, Britain was the treasury, and India had now become a resource depot to be used until the very end. At that time, India was one of the largest industrial centers in the world. Nearly 25% of global production came from here. There were many people and labor costs were extremely cheap, almost close to being free. Silk, cotton, muslin, gold, silver. What happened over time? India was deliberately deindustrialized. British goods entered India without any tariff restrictions, while Indian production was suffocated under heavy taxes. These heavy taxes, combined with nearly free British labor costs, brought local production to a halt. Many sectors collapsed. Indian weavers were forced to accept prices 40% below market value. Centuries-old crafts disappeared. The masters who wove the world's finest fabrics were reduced to indebted laborers and erased within a few decades. This was not just economic management, it was a form of murder. Because production stopped at every stage and imported goods were expensive, the already poor population was forced to live below the starvation line. As a result, between 7 to 10 million people died in the Bengal famine of 1769 to 1770. For the company, this did not matter, because there were enough people anyway, and the system they designed required no aid. They did not help. Taxes were collected even while people starved to death. While millions were dying from hunger, the money flowing to London did not decrease. This was not a mistake. It was a deliberately engineered, merciless system. And the result was clear. In 1750, India's share of the world economy was 25%. After 150 years of this brutal strategy, by 1900 it had fallen to 2%. In the same period, Britain's share rose, the exact opposite trend. In other words, Britain's rise was built on India's destruction. Nearly all the economic and production activities banned or crippled in India were filled by Britain. That was the plan, and it worked. Then came another dark chapter, the opium trade. The East India Company transformed from a regional power into the world's largest narcotics cartel. Indian farmers were forced to cultivate opium. This opium was sold to China. When China resisted the entity poisoning its society, England, wanting to prevent the shutdown of the trade, routes feeding it, immediately declared war. The cause of the 1839 to 1842 Opium War was sold as freedom of trade, but the truth was simple: to prevent the interruption of the company's narcotics revenue. And England won. Opium became the second largest source of state income for Britain. In 1857, Indian soldiers rose up against the company's army occupying their own land. Britain crushed the rebellion in blood. And who was handed the bill? Of course, India again. The cost of suppressing the uprising was fully imposed on Indian taxpayers. The people were both oppressed and made to pay for it. Finally, the Crown supposedly dissolved the company. But in reality, all they did was change the signboard. The shop was the same, only the name changed. The essence of exploitation remained. Only its form changed. Was India free after this? Of course not. From then on, the entirety of India became the financial vault of the British Crown. Half of all revenue extracted from India went directly to the British Army, and that army was stationed there to keep India under control. Railways are often described as a gift to Indians, but every rail line was built with Indian debt, and all construction materials and equipment were purchased from England. But the ones who paid the debt were Indians. The loser was India. The winner was Britain. This machine of exploitation reached its peak during the two world wars. Between 1914 to 1918, more than 1 million Indian soldiers fought for Britain. Millions of tons of food, metal, and cotton were sent to England, most of it financed by the Indian people. Why didn't Britain finance these things itself? Because why would it use its own treasury or its own gold when it had perfectly subjugated colonies, providing everything it needed almost for free? During World War II, the situation became even worse. The Indian Army, drawn from this colonized land, grew to 3.35 million men. Britain's World War expenses had reached a point where not even its own treasury nor its colonies were enough anymore. To cover these costs, Britain wrote massive IOUs to India, sterling balances. By the end of the war, India had become Britain's largest creditor, and right in this period, the 1943 Bengal famine erupted. According to estimates, somewhere between 800,000 and 3.8 million people died directly or indirectly. Britain diverted Indian grain to Europe. The little grain Indians had was taken by the British, and as if that wasn't enough, Churchill said, "Let the Indians look after themselves. He even tried to use starvation as a bargaining chip to erase India's claims against Britain. When the war ended, Britain had won on paper, but in reality it had collapsed. Supply routes from the colonies were destroyed, nationalist movements and uprisings had begun, and British finances were drained. Britain may have appeared victorious on paper, but economically it was finished. The empire could no longer finance itself. Therefore, keeping India was impossible, and August 15, 1947 was not a day of freedom. It was a day of forced relinquishment. That's how the empire collapsed. The money ran out. The exploitation ended. The system fell apart. What has been told here is only a fraction of how Britain grew and what its power, shrouded in darkness, cost the world. But the story does not end here, because the financial collapse Britain experienced centuries ago is returning today, in a different form. The real destruction began after India slipped away, or more accurately, that is when the hidden collapse became visible. For centuries, the empire had been feeding its domestic system with wealth drained from the colonies. Without India, the primary engine of its growth, Britain was like a giant machine that had lost its main power source. The post-war destruction of the economy, the decline in production capacity, and the mountains of debt pushed the country onto a path of irreversible breakdown. And this was not the result of a few years. It was the beginning of a decay accumulated over decades. After 1947, Britain's economy never returned to its former state, because the bill for the war was far greater than anyone had guessed. National debt had risen to nearly twice the size of the entire economy. The state had begun to cover everything, even its debts, by borrowing more. This caused the interest burden to grow exponentially each year. As post-war governments tried to repair the destroyed infrastructure, the rot slowly appeared everywhere, in education, in health, in production, and in the workforce. By the 1960s, Britain might still have been acting like a great power, but the economic reality inside the country did not support this. Industrial capacity had weakened to the point of stagnation, technological investments had fallen behind the world, and the skilled workforce had not renewed itself. It had remained stagnant. Compared to Germany and Japan, two countries that had been destroyed in the war, Britain lagged behind, even though those two nations rose from their ashes while Britain couldn't even preserve what it had. Britain's system was progressing slowly, almost heavily, because the colonial system and the empire, which had been the engine of its growth, were no longer there. Instead of fulfilling the requirements of production and competition, Britain tried to lean on external resources by holding on to its old habits. In the 1970s, not only the country, but the entire world was shaken by an energy crisis. This period was a critical turning point for Britain. Because the explosion in energy prices directly crashed an economy that was already weak. Inflation skyrocketed, unemployment rose, companies shut down, government borrowing accelerated. But there was a deeper problem. Britain no longer had a productive workforce. The labor it had was already unskilled. While industrialized countries, especially in Asia and across the Atlantic, advanced in automation and efficiency, Britain could not regain the competitive power it had lost years earlier. This made the country increasingly dependent on the outside world and raised costs day by day. With the 1980s, the transition to a service economy accelerated. Britain tried to grow without producing, and that meant staying alive only through debt. The financial sector expanded. Banking became gigantic, but the real economy weakened. An economy that grows with debt means financial bubbles. These bubbles silently laid the foundation for the major collapse of the future. In the 1990s, globalization winds, especially at the beginning of the internet age, relieved the country for a while. The financial sector turned London into an attractive center again. But this was only a fragile shine, a momentary flash. Because the country still wasn't producing, Instead, it consumed what others produced by buying it from outside. National debt grew. In other words, the economy looked like it was shining, but its foundation was rotting. The biggest illusion of this period was the government's attempt to make people believe that this was a permanent stability, with fake growth narratives. And to some extent, it worked. Then came the financial collapse, the 2008 global crisis. And the true painful face of Britain's supposedly strong but internally decaying economy was revealed. The financial sector collapsed. Banks were on the brink of failure. The government announced bailout packages worth trillions of pounds to save the system. These bailout packages were operations to save the system and the order they had built, not the people. The people paid the price of these rescue operations. And this increased the debt even more. There was no production, no savings, no efficiency. The system was standing on paper, sustained by debt. The 2010s passed with austerity policies, but tightening belts does not fix a decaying structure. On the contrary, public services deteriorated, the healthcare system collapsed, the education system weakened. This fragile structure could not withstand a shock like Brexit. The Brexit decision in 2016 accelerated the economic collapse. So why did the steps of the post-Brexit collapse accelerate this much? Wasn't there anything that could stop or slow down this decline? Why did things get worse? In 2016, with a single referendum, the hope for recovery was shattered. Brexit, a country whose production was gone, whose ability to stand on its own feet had already weakened, eliminated its biggest economic advantage in one move. The moment the unrestricted access to the European Union ended, the British service sector hit a wall. Because the foundation of service trade is people, qualified brainpower and labor. It is not like trading goods or materials. You cannot send a human across a border the way you send a product or a truck. A person means this. Every country has its own financial, insurance, legal, and data regulations. Leaving the EU meant having to change, remove, or create new rules for all 27 countries individually. This created huge barriers to the movement of people in the service sector. By blocking the skilled labor that Britain used to easily access and failed to protect in time, the service sector and exports slowed, costs increased, and British companies were pushed out of competition. The sector that had carried growth for years suddenly stumbled and became insufficient. Then came the second blow. Europe's labor force left. When free movement for EU citizens ended, hundreds of thousands of workers exited the country. A gap appeared in both unskilled and skilled labor. Suddenly, the country lost more than 100,000 truck drivers, tens of thousands of nurses and care workers, logistics personnel, restaurant and shop workers. Production stopped, distribution was delayed, hospitals became jammed, shelves in supermarkets remained empty. This was an unprecedented weakness in modern Britain. Without labor, the economy simply did not function. Brexit's third impact was the trade deficit. When Britain fell outside the EU, goods became subject to customs duties, paperwork, waiting times, new costs. Trade slowed down. Exports decreased. Imports became more expensive. The industrial sector, already collapsed beyond recovery, fell apart even more under the weight of new bureaucracy. The country began importing more and exporting less. This expanded the current account deficit. As the deficit grew, debt increased. As debt increased, the interest burden that needed to be repaid became heavier. By 2020, the coronavirus pandemic hit the world and hit the UK even harder. The economy stopped. A country that already had no production took on massive new debt again. Then the Ukraine war broke out and energy prices soared. These crises pushed Britain into the final stage of the massive debt cycle that had been ongoing since 1947. Today, the country is still stuck in the same problem. A non-producing economy, a workforce that doesn't grow, rising debt, and a collapsing public system. When Russia cut Europe's gas supply, the energy crisis delivered the final blow to the UK. Prices went into shock. Household bills tripled within a year. Inflation hit its highest level in 40 years because prices rose in every area. Real wages fell. Poverty exploded. Today, 2 million people in the UK go at least one day a month without eating. This used to be a third world statistic. Now it is Britain's reality. When all of this came together, a painful picture appeared. The country cannot produce. It loses its workforce because it failed to develop it. It lost its commercial access because bureaucracy increased. And it is crushed under the interest payments of the debt it took on. All of this says only one thing. Britain is reliving the modern version of its own history. In the past, when India was gone, the money was gone. Today, when there is no production, the economy is gone. The final question is there a way out? Yes, but it is not easy. The country must rebuild its production and labor capacity. Dependence on foreign labor in the service sector must be broken. Trade networks must be rebuilt. The debt-interest balance must be brought under control. But above all, Britain must accept that the thing that once gave it power, the constant inflow of wealth from the outside, will never return. A nation that rises on someone else's wealth will always fall when that wealth stops. This is exactly Britain's financial story from past to present. If you liked it or found it helpful, you can subscribe, like, or share. The choice is yours. See you in the next video.